Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's solo flight special is being captained by Randy Wright. We know you have a choice in your radio listening pleasure, and we would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, so please fasten your seatbelts and ensure that all seatbacks and tray tables are stowed in the upright and locked positions. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show as we cruise above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style. Once again, we thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we're confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, on today's show, we're going to discuss a term of semantics that has been used by the left ever since the 1960s, and that is the term New Left. Now, normally you don't hear this in just your general mainstream media circles. This is something that is more reserved for the ivory tower of academia. But since we've already discussed the litany of problems and chaos that is just rippling throughout college campuses here in the United States, I think it's important to focus on this type of historical identity of the left, this term that they have used. So what is the New Left? Well, the term was adopted and actually utilized in the 1960s by the left in an attempt to distance themselves from hardline communists. You have to remember that in the 1960s, America was in the immediate aftermath of the second Red Scare. And yes, I will actually be getting into the first Red Scare later on in the program. A lot of people are not even aware of the fact that there were actually two historical periods in United States history known as the Red Scare. So, the left in America had feared the power and influence that Senator Joseph McCarthy and his investigations into un-American activities back in the 50s had amassed, especially with the resonance that it held with the American population. There really was this disdain for communism, especially after the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. America rightfully saw their influence in the world being threatened. And not just their influence, their way of life, their very free market system, everything that is good and decent that we find within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution was under direct threat. Remember, this was also in the immediate aftermath of the Korean War, and we were beginning to start the process of working our way into Vietnam. And this was because of the domino theory that was in place at the time. Now, what the domino theory was this notion that communism would topple the nations of the world like a series of dominoes. And this was seen within Eastern Europe when the Iron Curtain descended after the immediate end of World War II, and it was seen with the rise of communist China under Mao Zedong in 1948. And that, placed pressure on places like Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all of the places that we eventually saw communism arise in the Orient was part of this domino theory which frightened everyone. And so the left in America was exceedingly sensitive to this idea that the American population was opposed to anything that reeked of socialism or communism. And they had good reason to feel that way, because that is obviously what their positions entail, and they had experienced it before in the first Red Scare. And like I said, we'll delve into that a little bit later. So in order to understand how there could even be a claim for the term New Left, we have to delve into the quote-unquote old left. And that brings us to a term that we hear used quite frequently in the parlance of modern politics here in America, and that is the term progressives. The progressive movement was started by Republican President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, I know that this may be shocking to a lot of people, but the truth of the matter is Theodore Roosevelt was an all-out person for government. He absolutely loathed the idea that the private sector could wield any power or influence over the federal government. He wanted a centralized authority that could command to everyone from top down how things were to be. And therefore, he decided that the best way to do this would be in progressive steps. Now, he purposefully chose that word in the game of semantics that we have seen utilized time and again by the radical and extreme fringes of the left in America in order to change the meaning. It's very deceptive and intellectually disingenuous in the way that it's used, because it conjures up images that they are for progress, and that anyone who stands in opposition to their radical agenda is clearly antiquated, clearly out of touch with the American people, and clearly wants to hold the average guy down, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. But that is what Theodore Roosevelt had wanted to do. And he loathed the fact that the president was not considered the most powerful man in the country. That fell to the private industrialists who had risen to power with the acclamation of incredible wealth, the likes of which we still have not seen. Because if you compare what the industrialists during the Gilded Age held, it was much more than what even Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or any of the others of the top echelon hold in America today. But the messaging was the same. Theodore Roosevelt decided that he would turn the American population against these industrial giants by engaging in a propaganda campaign. And as I had mentioned in my solo flight addressing the rise of the mainstream media, the basic propaganda and sensationalist media that we suffer with today, that was a willing audience and participant with yellow journalism and William Randolph Hearst. Remember, Roosevelt had worked with Hearst before in order to conjure up support for his excursion in Cuba with the Spanish-American War. And Hearst was able to fan the flames of public opinion to put them solidly in the camp of the Secretary of the Navy at that time. And then, of course, he went over with the Rough Riders to fight in Cuba. But by using selective outrage, false stories, sensationalized stories, and accounts of atrocities that had occurred in Cuba back in 1898, Hearst was able to solidly swing public opinion in favor of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt's opinions had been known by the political powers that be at the time, and that is why when President William McKinley had been elected, the powers that be, the upper echelons of the Republican Party, wanted to place Theodore Roosevelt in a position where he could do the least amount of damage and have the least amount of influence, but they could still garner the vote of this up-and-coming progressive movement in America, and so they stuck him in the office of vice president. Well, unfortunately for their plans, William McKinley was assassinated, and that propelled Theodore Roosevelt to the highest office in the land. And when President Roosevelt assumed the reins of power, he wanted to exponentially increase the scope of power and influence and control of the office of president. And so he set about on a rapid-fire media campaign, basically a propaganda campaign, to attack the pillars of industry, the actual power base that had wielded incredibly influential apparatuses of power within the country. And yes, there was room for corruption there, but I certainly don't think that it fell to the extent that Theodore Roosevelt was trying to convince everyone in America that it went to, because he was just on a rampage to gain power for the federal government. And we could see that with some of the movements that he pushed for, things like the establishment of national parks by stripping away land from people through the power of eminent domain, and there were certainly questions about whether he was giving the property owners fair market value for what their property was worth. He pushed for increased government regulation over business and finance. He basically wanted to fundamentally transform the apparatus of government and the tenets of federalism here in the United States. And if that language sounds familiar to you, it is because it is the same type of language that is used by President Obama. You all recall that during his first campaign back in 2008, President Obama stood before the cameras of the salivating mainstream media and unabashedly proclaimed that his goal was to fundamentally transform the United States. Well, again, this shows that what he was doing is nothing new. The left has not proposed new ideas. Rather, they just double down on the failed policies of the past. And we see the inception of the movement and the term progressives with Theodore Roosevelt. So we're talking turn of the century, because William McKinley, if memory serves me correctly, had been assassinated in 1900. So this is Theodore Roosevelt coming in, riding on the wave of popularity that he still had after the Spanish-American War, and he exerted extreme amounts of power and influence over the federal government. And he went about attempting to reform the way business worked in the United States, and he started that with this media blitz against the industrial titans of the era. And he was the one that also helped Hearst push this term of robber baron. You see, that conjures up negative connotations with respect to the titans of industry. He disregarded the fact that they were exceedingly generous with their money that they had given to all of these philanthropic endeavors. I mean, Carnegie Hall, the Rockefeller Center. You had all of these things that had been put in place by these industrialists who actually did want people to advance and do better. But they also wanted to secure as much capital and wealth for themselves as humanly possible. And yes, they did exert their control over the market to create certain advantages for themselves. That's the notion of insider trading. And of course, you know that Congress is still not prohibited from engaging in insider trading. Neither is the president. Basically, none of your governmental actors are prohibited from engaging in insider trading, but private citizens are. I know that I've mentioned the story of Martha Stewart before, and of course it's an old story now, but it bears a significant amount of relevance to the topic at hand here because she was accused of insider trading. She was sent to prison for that. But because of this progressive mindset that originated with Theodore Roosevelt, and yes, folks, he was a Republican, so don't buy into this idea that Democrats are the ones to blame for the birth of the progressive movement, because it just simply is not true. The historical evidence and primary sources clearly indicate that it was Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, that had established the progressive ideology in here within the United States. And what he had done by using and utilizing this whole propagandistic term of robber baron is allied himself with the likes of radical organized labor unionists like Eugene V. Debs, who had pushed for radical, if not violent, reformation of American industry. And again, there's another term that they use in a game of semantics, trying to say that it's reforming industry in America, reforming the way that the free market enterprise system works. No, it's not reforming, it's destroying. But again, it just shows the intellectual disingenuous nature of the radical and extreme left here in America, and that they have engaged in this for well over 100 years. And that's why I have said that for a long time, the left has been devoted, almost zealously, in fact, zealously, they are obsessively devoted to this idea of pressing forward with increased government control. And they didn't view this as an instant gratification process, although with people like Eugene V. Debs and the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, they wanted instant gratification, and they'd take it if they could get it through violent, revolutionary, radical change within the finance and industry sectors of the American economy. And they found a powerful and staunch ally in Theodore Roosevelt, although he couldn't just come out in the open and proclaim support for it, because the vast majority of American citizens at that time were still agrarian in nature. They were still distrustful of government. After all, there had been these numerous economic panics and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, which left them completely untrusting of government, because in many cases it was a government attempt to impinge upon the free operation of our markets, disallowing them a chance to correct themselves. And then there would be a wave of change politically, and somehow it always came back to a laissez-faire or hands-off approach to the economy and to the workings of government that would then allow the markets to correct themselves, and then there'd be a period of boom. So basically, it was like a hydraulic economic system here in the United States with multiple cycles of boom and bust, but it was never a long, sustained period of depression. But the radical left and the fledgling progressive movement saw this as an opportunity to flex their muscles and expand their power and to sink their claws into the governmental framework of the United States. And of course, they did this in a way that is opposed to the natural law tenets that are contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, because they saw that as an impediment to the expansion of governmental power, control, and influence. And of course, this is absolutely true because of the way that our founding fathers had developed the Constitution. It was designed to prevent a government from becoming this all-powerful entity that could just encroach upon the fundamental and unalienable rights of the people at whim. And that is exactly what Theodore Roosevelt and the progressives wanted. And of course, you see that with the national park systems. You see that with a lot of the protectionist type economic stances that Roosevelt took. He didn't do that so much to protect American interests. Rather, he did it to chip away at the power and influence of those he deemed robber barons. We're talking your Andrew Carnegies, your Rockefellers, your titans of industry. And this included Thomas Edison and even Henry Ford, although Henry Ford was certainly a later addition to it. And so how did he do this? Well, he turned to Congress and applied pressure on them to pass something known as the Sherman Antitrust Act. So he champions this movement targeting the corporate monopolies which controlled entire segments of America's industry. And this had been something that had developed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. This is where your monopoly started to develop, particularly with the railroads and then steel, and then with banking with J.P. Morgan, and they exerted incredible control over the markets, the likes of which we have not seen before or since. And what they would do is, yes, they would have meetings in which they would determine what companies they would attack in, aggressive takeover movements, and how they would protect their investments even during a time of economic depression. And for Theodore Roosevelt, this just was intolerable. Only the government should have that kind of power, and he thought that the president, not even Congress, should be able to exert absolute autonomy and control over economic policy in the United States. Now, of course, that is not in line with what we find within the four corners of the United States Constitution. After all, Article 1, Section 8 clearly states that commerce is to be regulated by Congress. And when you look at the actual framework of our Constitution, the three branches of government, while it is claimed they are co-equal, the reason it was claimed that they were co-equal is that they are supposed to be able to only act within the enumerated powers. Now, that does not mean that each branch of government was enumerated with the same amount of power or even the same amount of influence. That's simply not true. And you can see that in the way that Article 1, which defines and enumerates the power of the legislature, is written. It's the longest and largest of the branches of government, and that was by design. Then the president has a certain amount of power, and Article 2 clearly lists what those duties are, and it's much less than that of the legislature. And thirdly, the judiciary, through Article 3, has its own sets of power, which are clearly enumerated, and are also clearly less than what was wielded by the legislature. Now, I know that we have stated on past episodes of the Wright Flyer that the judiciary amassed power for itself, which was not delegated to it pursuant to Article 3, and that was the case of Marbury versus Madison, once again going to the turn of the 19th century, and slowly but surely the courts were stripping away at the powers of the other branches of government. But it was never fully intended that the courts would exert the amount of power that they did through judicial review. Essentially, the court took it upon itself to determine what was or was not constitutional for all of the branches of government. And when you actually look at the language contained within Article 3, that's just not what the article says. But because of the crafty machinations of Chief Justice Marshall, we did see a radical transformation of the powers and authority wielded by the judiciary, and they have essentially become the most powerful branch of government. But it was never originally intended to be that way. But going back to the Sherman Antitrust Act that was championed by President Roosevelt, he basically started a campaign by pointing to the various economic panics of the late 19th century and early 20th century that hit America. And, while this was an expected part of the way business and commerce operated in the United States, he placed the blame squarely at the feet of the industrialists. Now, yes, it is true that some of their dealings did actually trigger the onset of some of these panics, but by allowing the market to correct itself, these periods were rather short. Nothing like what we would see with the Wall Street crash of October of 1929. But he said that, the entire economy has been destabilized by these so-called robber barons, and that is because they exert so much power, influence, and control that they are single-handedly manipulating the market. And therefore, when they create these massive monopolies, they are able to deny people the ability to embetter themselves, and they essentially stagnate the market. They prevent the market from growing as it ought to. And he said that it was the government's responsibility to do this, and so he leaned very heavily on Congress to pass this notion or this statute called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And he followed this claim that the robber barons had full control of the economy by saying that, look at the staggering wage gap or wealth gap in the United States. And he said that that was a part of the robber barons' plan to absolutely control the entire economic fortunes of the United States. Of course, that's really not quite true because, as I said, they engaged in these marvelous philanthropic activities from which we still benefit from. I mean, Carnegie Hall is gorgeous, just absolutely gorgeous. And then a bunch of the libraries that were started by Rockefeller contributed to education, the likes of which we still haven't seen from private trusts and endowments like we did then. And it was just an unprecedented amount of education and knowledge that they had brought to the people. But anyway, Roosevelt was waging a crusade against these powerful titans of industry. And what this had done is really placed the notion of what the courts at that time called economic due process in extreme jeopardy. And that was Roosevelt's intent. So what is this economic due process that I mentioned? Well, we have to look at a Supreme Court case that was decided in 1905. It was Lochner v. New York. And in that, the Supreme Court clearly showed that it did not trust the moves inspired by Roosevelt's crusade against industry, and of course championed by the radical left that were now all adopting the moniker of progressive, and they single-handedly slapped him down. So what was Lochner about? Well, Lochner's attorney contended that a New York statute, which had established a mandatory minimum wage for bakers, actually violated a worker's ability to negotiate their working conditions and the terms of their contract, because the statute disallowed bakers the ability to use their wage as a quintessential bargaining chip. And there is really a lot of truth to this, because it was viewed as a contracting right that is possessed by everyone. In fact, that was at that time considered, as it should be through the pursuit of happiness, as a fundamental and unalienable right. Your ability to contract is a type of intellectual property. It is your property. Your body to give labor is something that you can use as a commodity. It is something that is able to be bought and sold and bargained for. And that is what the courts ruled on. They said that, yes, this is definitely a right that the people have, and any type of mandatory law passed by a state that would infringe upon that is, by its nature, absolutely violative of the letter and spirit of the supreme law of the land, which is, of course, the United States Constitution. Now, the attorneys for the state of New York had argued that, look, what we did is permissible with this statute. We acted lawfully by using our general police power to legislate for the health, safety, and morality of our people. And yes, they even did make a morality-based argument stating that a higher wage for all workers at all levels within the state and the city of New York would be beneficial for the morality of the workers, because then they would have more to pay and they wouldn't be so tempted, was the argument, to engage in the sorts of nefarious activities which were the targets of groups like the Christian temperance movement at that time, which is a strange bedfellow for the progressives, because as we have seen with this modern wave of progressive actions and thought, they are not really in line with religious doctrines or the free exercise of religion or the freedom of religion. But remember, this was still in an era before prohibition had set in, and the temperance movement was really starting to gain steam, because it was seen as this thing that held the chastity and well-being of the people paramount in its concerns. And they also believed that the unfettered access to alcohol really was a social problem. But as we would see with the Volstead Act of 1919 and just this horrific rise of organized crime, their response to turn to government to prohibit people from being able to purchase and drink alcohol really didn't work. It made things much worse, and it made the country a much more dangerous place. And it also gives credence to this whole old adage of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It doesn't matter how good their intentions were, they unleashed untold amounts of suffering and misery onto the American people in this campaign to legislate morality. So you see the rise of blue laws, but New York was making this argument with respect to the bakers, and the Supreme Court said, no, the Constitution is clear. As per Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, it is every individual's due process right to be able to use their labor as a bargaining tip. And that includes the ability to contract for wages. And so what the court had shown there was a complete readiness and willingness to stand up to the so-called reform efforts of the progressive movement as championed by Theodore Roosevelt. But despite the free market stance of the Supreme Court, progressives were undaunted. They saw an opportunity for them to fundamentally transform the country, which had been their goal from the inception. And we see this with what became known as the Standard Oil battle. Now, here we're going to actually look at the titan of our oil and gas industry, Rockefeller. Rockefeller was a self-made man. He had pulled himself up from the threadbare existence of poverty and cornered a market where he saw an opportunity to provide a drastically needed service to the people. And he saw a way to completely capitalize off of his investments. He took a huge risk and it paid off. And the company that he created was known as the American Standard Oil Company. He thought that what they should do is provide a standard, safe manufacturing process for kerosene oils and fuels to be used in the gas lamps that were prevalent at the time. And so he included that into the name of his company, the American Standard Oil Company. And this was also kind of with the start of Standard Leland in Idaho and Indiana. These were the major areas where he could make refineries to then provide the sole source of cheap and effective lighting in America. And that's exactly what he did. He had monopolized the market by either scaring off the competition by saying, look, you don't want to use this stuff, it's not safe. Or when he had amassed enough capital, he had managed to be able to buy them out. And this was in line with the type of things that you saw with Carnegie, with Vanderbilt and his railroads, and with later on J.P. Morgan with banking and finance. So you had these massive conglomerations of companies that really did exert control over the market. But what they were doing was acting in a way that was completely constitutionally permissible. But with the rise of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the government made it its heartfelt duty to go out and drastically change the economic landscape of the United States. And again, this is why Jeremy and I say that the economy per se by itself is not important, because the economy is but a reflection of what is happening with respect to government. And when government operates outside the scope and boundary of our shared United States Constitution, that is when we see the entire system begin to implode upon itself and the economy stagnates as a result. In other words, what we see with the economy is a symptom, not a direct cause of the problems that are here. And of course, the policy positions of the government are what really influence this. Now, policy, again, is kind of a term of art, one of those semantic things that the progressives seized upon to bastardize the meaning of the term in order to really make it seem as though that is what counts and the Constitution is a mere guideline. But once again, folks, as per Article 6, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, the United States Constitution itself is, in fact, the supreme law of the land. And irrespective of whatever efforts the progressives have tried to use throughout history, it does not change the fact that a legitimate government here in the United States, pursuant to the longest contiguous constitutional document in world history, is the supreme law of the land, despite all of their efforts to say otherwise or to change its power, scope, application, and meaning. So, we then turn to the attack on Standard Oil. Basically, Standard had to redefine itself with the rise of electric lighting. Thomas Alva Edison's invention of the electric light really did make Standard's original business model totally antiquated, because now you had a light source that did not require an open flame. It was clean. Electricity was a clean source of energy and power. It was more efficient, and it created brighter light. And so Rockefeller was forced to find an alternative to the business model that he had developed originally, because it just was to a point now that it was unsustainable. And so he sent an army of scientists to discover uses for a byproduct that was created when he was drilling for the kerosene and natural gas that he used for his lighting and lamp service. And that byproduct was known as petroleum. And for the first several decades that he was in business, they just tossed that out as a worthless byproduct. They had no idea how to use it. But he had the foresight to see that that could be used for something, and that it had to be used for something because it was cheap, readily producible. It was the stuff that would come off the top. And so the scientists began to find that it could be used to create a jelly-type substance. Plastics were starting to come into existence now. And then with the rise of Henry Ford's Model T, or the Tin Lizzie, all of a sudden there was a new market for lubricating with this oil, this petroleum. And so American Standard then became the most powerful supplier of oil and petroleum-based products for industry and for travel and for just basic products. So all of a sudden, because he had taken this risk, when his business was on its way out, he managed to create a monopoly. It was his intellectual property to do with as he saw fit, and he understood that he needed to make a need for the product. He made a need for it, and that put him ahead of the game. And that is how he was able to maintain a monopoly. But because of the rise of the progressive movement with Theodore Roosevelt, the government decided that it would target the American Standard Oil Company to basically make an example of it and to show all of the other industry titans that the government would be the one and only monopoly that would be accepted here in the United States. And that is what they did with the Sherman Antitrust Act. They brought Rockefeller into a tribunal. Their attorney humiliated him by asking him about things he had said in many cases 30 to 40 years earlier, because he was an old man by this time, and he just was made to look like an idiot. And they did the same thing with Henry Ford when they tried to say that, look, the American Automobile Trust had patented the automobile and that he couldn't do it, that he couldn't go out and make his car because that was in violation of their patents. And they basically grilled him on American history. Well, here was a man who was self-educated. He didn't know about American history. And they made him look terrible on the stand. And basically, it galvanized both Rockefeller and Ford to turn against everything that was happening here and to just stick their heels in the mud and drag the process out. But the truly nefarious thing about it was that this was an unprecedented power grab by the federal government. Again, something that was not provided for within the confines of our shared Constitution. This is, again, why Jeremy and I always say that the Constitution should be your litmus test and guide. And it is why it is so important that you gain a fluent working knowledge and understanding of your Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. Because now what the government was able to do via the Sherman Antitrust Act would be to tell which businesses could be a monopoly and which could not, and they were basically able to micromanage all of American industry. And that's what they started to do. And they found a willing champion and ally in the radical left, as personified by Eugene V. Debs and the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and all of the other various labor union movements and organizations that were attempting to exert increased power and control. And so we see a gradual shift away from the notion of economic due process to this idea of, no, really, business is not something that would be a due process right, and the courts would change the way they approached it. Because when it was under the Lochner era, it was given strict scrutiny, which in all actuality, with respect to due process, if you stop and think about it, should be the only level of scrutiny that should be applied. But no, the court started to manipulate it and change its meaning and application to where now if you have a business complaint based on any type of due process claim, they're not going to give you strict scrutiny, which states that the government is forced to overcome a rebuttable presumption of what they did is wrong by showing that there is a drastically important, very important governmental reason and interest in preventing this right. Well, they dropped it to the lowest level of so-called rational basis. That means the presumption is that the one who is bringing the violation claim of his or her due process rights must prove that what the government did was wrong and that it was not narrowly tailored to provide just a basic governmental interest. And see, this basic governmental interest is that the government did not act in an arbitrary or capricious manner. And what the rational basis standard of review allows is for the judge to just sit there and speculate any reason that the government may have had to encroach upon this due process right of the claimant, even if the government had not made such an argument in their briefs or in their complaints or responses to the court. And that is clearly a detrimental standard. In fact, I even argue and contend that it really is not in line with the way that the Constitution meant for our judiciary to work. But that is another topic for another show. But they had gone forward and taken away economic due process, even though it still existed at the time. And the tribunal that they had with Rockefeller was basically nothing short of a show trial designed to make the public think that the government was working within the confines of the United States Constitution, and to also give this false and erroneous perception that the government was looking out for the interests of the people. But they weren't. They were abiding by the guiding principles of the progressive movement as envisioned by Theodore Roosevelt, and they were taking it to the next extreme. And when they broke up Standard Oil, it opened the floodgates. Next was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, Ma Bell, as it was colloquially known. They broke that up, so then you started seeing Southwestern Bell, all of the other little baby bells, as they called them, develop and rise in our industry and business in America. And it really did kind of put a clamp on the type of expansive innovation that we saw at the turn of the 20th century. After all, that is why that era is referred to as the Gilded Age in America. it seemed that the sky was the limit, that technological innovation could propel us to a new standard. And again, that also played into the name of the American Standard Oil Company. Not only was it a new standard of safety when he was first using kerosene, but it was also a new standard uniform way of lighting and providing a better environment for the people. But that's not how the progressives viewed it. The progressives viewed American industry with distrust. They loathed it. They would rather follow the edicts of the Fabian socialists in Europe and to devise a centralized command and control economy, and they would do anything to achieve that here in the United States. But they realized that they had to do it in small and progressive steps. Incrementalization, as Jeremy and I have reiterated on past episodes of The Wright Flyer. And that is why they called themselves the Progressive Movement. And so that's exactly what they were trying to do with Standard Oil. So, Standard Oil is broken up. It was found to violate the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the government was also attempting to make a glaring example out of the company. So, once they had finished with American Standard, they targeted the other captains of industry, and they really did start to weaken the way the economy worked. And this sort of went under the rug with the start of World War I. So with World War I, we see the rise of Woodrow Wilson and his doctrine of wartime socialism. Now, Woodrow Wilson was, basically typical of the pattern of 20th century Democrats. They would campaign on this notion of, we will keep America neutral and out of wars. And then as soon as they'd get elected, somehow, some way, we would find ourselves in a war. In the case of Woodrow Wilson, it was World War I. In the case of later on with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was World War II. And in both instances, they both secretly wanted to engage the United States in these foreign wars, but they knew that public sentiment was not on their side, so they would lie and obfuscate the truth in an attempt to pull the wool over the eyes of the American people, and then once they were in, then they would leave. Now, that's not to say that America's involvement in World War I did not amount to being a good thing. Yes, what the Germans did was wrong, and truly, American sentiment did start to turn in favor of war, first after the sinking of the passenger liner, the Lusitania, and then when it was revealed that the German ambassador, Zimmermann, had offered to Mexico, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Utah, all of the states they had basically ceded in the Gadsden Purchase after the Mexican-American War back to Mexico. That gave Wilson the cause de resistance to push for America's entry into the war in Europe. Now, of course, President Wilson had ulterior motives for wanting America's involvement in the First World War. He saw this as an opportunity to further expand the progressive ideology that had been started by Theodore Roosevelt about just a decade earlier, a little more than a decade earlier, but he saw this as a chance to exponentially expand the power, scope, influence, and control exerted and exercised by the federal government. It was something to the tune of 320%. That's how much he grew the government. And that was after the government had been exponentially expanded under the leadership of the first progressive, the father of the progressive movement, Theodore Roosevelt. And Woodrow Wilson utilized the up-and-coming fledgling motion picture industry in Hollywood to champion his ideals. He used them to fan the flames of the passions of public opinion to be in favor of war, and then to control what would be said through censorship. And so all of a sudden we saw once again a progressive leader claiming to be looking out for the best interests of the American people, yet nevertheless was curtailing, abridging, and encroaching upon their fundamental and unalienable rights, whether it be free speech, whether it be the now destroyed doctrine of economic due process, whatever it was, they marched against it. And they just showed that they were diametrically opposed to the fundamental natural law tenets and principles contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. And so Wilson had exhibited a full amount of control in America. In fact, he had used the labor unions to help him also gain full control over industry for the makings of munitions and other supplies and materiel for war. And this, too, drastically and radically transformed the political landscape of the United States. And, of course, during the Wilson administration, we also saw the ratification of several amendments that would also drastically change the landscape of government in America and push the boundaries of the Constitution further away, even though they had utilized the process of passing an amendment to ratify these amendments. Of course, there are, to this day, lingering questions about the method in which they allegedly ratified these amendments and whether that was in line with the requirements of Article 5 within the United States Constitution. And in many ways, I think they did not adhere to it, but because it is an established precedent, you're not going to find the government pushing back to roll back these amendments. And the two amendments which I really speak to here are the 16th and 17th Amendments, respectively. Well, the 16th Amendment was the federal income tax. That was the first time that the government finally gained the ability to permanently and supposedly legitimately reach their hands into the coffers and pockets of hardworking, decent American citizens and strip them of their hard-earned wages through the doctrine of taxation. And of course, this was all couched in the notion of, well, it's there to help the war. No, not really. What it was a ploy by the federal government to increase their power, once again solidifying the progressive ideology as established by Theodore Roosevelt and ensuring that the government would become the all-powerful, all-knowing entity in the United States, as opposed to private industry. And so when you go back again to the fundamental principles contained within the United States Constitution and the actual tenets of federalism as it was devised by our founding fathers, with the ratification of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, it was also further stripping away sovereignty from the true arbiters and holders of sovereignty in America, we the people. So we see that this was once again devised as a way to take power away from the people, to concentrate it in the hands of government, but to placate the people, to make them think that, okay, what we're really doing is looking out for your best interests. What we're going to do is then pass the 17th Amendment, which will allow there to be direct sufferance or direct vote, direct elections for the Senate. Now, until the ratification of the 17th Amendment, the state legislatures of the several states would select their senators, and they could remove them at will. And the purpose for this was the House of Representatives was meant to be the body that would basically be the people's house. It was the one in which the people would exert control. It was the one in which the people would have a say. And then the Senate was designed to be something to protect the interests of the several states, because the way that our tenets of federalism was developed was to allow the states to exert greater power because they're closer to the people and are a representative body of the people in which the people had a direct control. So there really was not this need for a direct popular election within the Senate. But Woodrow Wilson and the progressives monumentally changed that, fundamentally transformed the way government worked in the United States, and it changed the entire atmosphere in Washington, D.C. No longer were the states considered co-sovereigns with the federal government. Now, the floodgates had been opened for the states to be subjugated. The very fears that the anti-federalists had brought up in their papers back during the Constitutional Convention. And so we see again that they were utilizing the power of federal government, couching it in this intellectually disingenuous fashion that they were doing it within the proper confines of government and within the legitimate ways of the Constitution, and yet nothing could be further from the truth. Now, at the same time with industry, we see the International Workers of the World, this radical labor union who had allied itself and was basically run by a devious individual by the name of Eugene V. Debs, who saw the war itself as an opportunity to increase so-called collective bargaining to where, again, the idea that economic due process is an individual right, as was intended by the Constitution, to something that, no, the workers have to be viewed collectively through unions. So that would set the standard of bargaining. So what a union does is it takes away your ability to negotiate your worth or value through your commodities. They essentially take away your value as a worker and your control to determine what you will work for, what benefits you might get, etc. And it was through a thuggish and collectivist mentality that Eugene V. Debs pushed for this. And they did manage to gain a rather rapid expansion of their power, but also to exert this power because the government was basically in a bind because they needed these war munitions, and the government had threatened the factory owners and the industry titans with nationalization of their companies if they failed to produce for the war effort. So this was sort of an unwritten alliance that you had between the progressives and the movement of so-called organized labor in the United States. It absolutely, completely, totally, and fundamentally transformed the way that business was conducted in the United States, and it threatened our industrial system and our natural law system as contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. Now, with the end of the war and the October Revolution in Russia, all of a sudden the idea of organized labor became a danger because it had been labor unions that had helped push the Bolsheviks into power within the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden there were fears that this Leviathan of a radical Bolshevik Marxist movement would arise in the United States. And certainly the pamphlets and literature and language utilized by the Wobblies, or the international workers of the world, would suggest that, yes, they would openly push and advocate for a violent takeover to fundamentally transform the United States. And again, it's the same type of language that we hear with movements like Occupy Wall Street, even though they're gone now, the Black Lives Matters organizations, all of these organizations that sit there and want to say, look, the United States is actually this mean-spirited, hateful place and should not be allowed to continue as it was developed and designed and envisioned by the Founding Fathers over 2 centuries ago, and that we should abandon this great document, our shared United States Constitution, which, again, is the longest running constitution in world history. No, they wanted to throw that by the wayside because it didn't necessarily coincide with the vision that they had for the world. And they saw themselves as the arbiters of this new workers' paradise. The same type of thing that you saw arise in the Soviet Union is what you were seeing with radical labor here in America. And another interesting historical aspect of this time period that coincides with what's happening in the modern parlance of American politics was this idea of siding with the underdog of quote-unquote immigrants. Well, you know, the illegal alien issue is a paramount concern with the 2016 election that's coming up, and this coincides almost a century after the concerns they had with these radical Central European immigrants who were anarchists. And folks, these fears were not unfounded, because after the end of World War I, the Wobblies attempted to distance themselves a little bit from these radical, primarily Italian anarchists who had recently migrated to the United States and were saying that they were going to throw off the shackles of government and target the United States Constitution as an oppressive document to get rid of the notion of private property. See, Eugene V. Debs, the Wobblies, and any one of these radical left-wing organizations and entities were diametrically opposed to the notion of private property, irrespective of the fact that actually, if you look at our fundamental and unalienable rights, chief among them is the pursuit of happiness, which has been extrapolated and interpreted to mean private property. Well, these nefarious organizations just absolutely loathed and despised the notion of private property. And so they wanted to create this socialist utopian workers' paradise in which everyone would not own anything, that it would just all be collectively owned. Kind of like the collective bargaining positions that you see with organized labor. Now, a problem had developed for the Wobblies and Eugene V. Debs with respect to their radical anarcho-allies when the anarchists had mounted an well-organized attack on the pillars of government and industry in the United States. This first occurred in 1919 when they sent a series of package bombs to the floor of the House of Representatives. That one failed to detonate. To the House of the Secretary of State, it failed to detonate. And to the House of the Attorney General. Now, it did detonate and cause damage. All of a sudden, the American people were faced with this ugly reality that this type of anarchist, radical, extreme, left-wing, communistical type system was staring them in the face, and it was going to strip them of their rights and plunge them into a bloody revolution like that in Russia. So now you had a clampdown. But it got even worse in 1920 with the Wall Street bombing. This occurred at the height of rush hour. They were targeting a bank and the stock market with an explosive. It was a wagon bomb, and it killed several people. And it marked the worst terrorist attack on American soil up until the terror attacks of 9/11. That is how long it stayed a major problem. And while there was rampant speculation as to who was actually behind it, the Wall Street bombing of 1920 remains unsolved to this day. But it sparked what was known as the First Red Scare. And folks, that was a legitimate response to a movement that was out to destroy everything that is good and decent about the United States of America. These people were opposed to our way of life, and it was quite clear from some of the literature that was available, but not enough to be proven in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, that these anarchist organizations were behind these attacks. They certainly championed them. And so all of a sudden you had the American population facing this problem, and they just weren't sure what to do. And it was a frightening time for the country, but they responded by saying, no, we got to throw these people out. We've got to either imprison them, execute them, get rid of them, because they are out to kill us. And it absolutely was true. That is what they were trying to do. So, because of the public backlash that had arisen in the immediate aftermath of these anarchist attacks, the progressives started to lose power and influence in the country. And this is when we saw the rise of one of the best presidential administrations that this country had ever seen. When Calvin Coolidge was elected to office, he started to roll back some of the wartime socialism measures that had been adopted during the Wilson administration. And even though the labor unions were still gaining ground, they lost a lot of steam, power, and influence. And they certainly were not as much of a threat as they had been during the Wilson administration. And we see the economy boom. When Calvin Coolidge started to make the government strictly adhere to the fundamental principles contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, the Roaring Twenties resulted. And we had an economic boom in the United States. The sky was the limit again. It was thought that America would never reach the depths of economic panic or despair again, and life was really good. The standard of living, the quality of living went up. Industry and technology was developing at a record pace. We had survived World War I. We had survived the nefarious attacks by the radical and extreme left to destabilize and disrupt and destroy our country. And we were on the path to being a great world leader. And that was all within the confines of our Constitution. The Constitution guaranteed that we would have that. As long as the government was willing to strictly adhere to the sacred principles contained within that fantastic document, America was on a path to prosperity. But with the arrival of October of 1929 and the Wall Street crash, the left saw a chance to completely revitalize their image. And unfortunately, it fell during the first and only administration of President Hoover. He was seized upon as a target to attack and vilify the image of those who supported strict adherence to the tenets and principles contained within our shared Constitution, and they launched a propaganda campaign against him, the likes of which this country has not seen in a long time. Although I would argue that we started to see it in the 2008 campaign, and we are certainly in the midst of it now, almost 100 years later. So, they vilified him by pointing to him and saying, see, he's saying he's going to continue doing what Coolidge did, but what Coolidge did obviously didn't work because look at how everyone's unemployed now. Look at these tent cities. Well, they're not just tent cities, they're Hoovervilles. Ah, there you have it. The first time that this radical agenda had successfully attached an entire economic and financial collapse on a singular individual. They unfairly, ruthlessly laid all the blame at the feet of Hoover. Because Hoover said, no, we need to continue a laissez-faire approach because if the government steps in, the market will be unable to correct itself. Well, because of that, Hoover lost the next election, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the mantle of power in the United States. And he was an autocratic imperial president, the likes of which this country has not known since or before, although Obama does come close. Roosevelt was able to secure 3 terms for himself and to push this New Deal. And again, the courts reacted the same way that they did when his cousin had held the highest office in the land. They fell back on this idea of economic due process. Well, that just didn't cut it for Roosevelt. He threatened the Supreme Court with a court-packing scheme. Now, to just show you how much of a serious threat that was to the judiciary in the United States, that was the worst threat to them since President John Adams did his midnight court-packing scheme that gave us Marbury versus Madison. In other words, Roosevelt was threatening to fundamentally transform the way that our government worked and the way that our courts worked, and the justices, who were all elderly men, were afraid of this because it meant that he would be able to railroad them and just push through these radical socialist policies of the New Deal carte blanche. So they bowed and capitulated to him in a way that had drastic and lasting ramifications for the country at large. And we see this with the beginning of the change of the interpretation of the Commerce Clause and a horrible Supreme Court case known as Wickard v. Filburn. In Wickard v. Filburn, the entire notion of economic due process was thrown out the window because it was said, no, it doesn't violate the rights of the individual because it's not a due process issue, it's a Commerce Clause issue, and the quotas for the production of wheat, even if it was above the quota just for the farmer's family, no, that substantially impacts or affects commerce and therefore can be regulated by Congress, and he should have to pay the fine. See, Wickard was just trying in the midst of the Great Depression to grow wheat for his family so that they could save some money and hold on to their land and not have it foreclosed upon. But the government said, no, we have these quotas, and you either produce within those quotas or you pay a fine. And, well, it was deemed that this was within the commerce power of Congress to regulate because it might impact a farmer down the road. So, again, we see the individual's rights stripped, trampled upon, and encroached upon by an out-of-control, overzealous federal government and this rise of a collectivist thought process. And this was the vision championed by the progressive movement. And FDR was certainly a part of this. And again, the progressives were lucky in timing with the arrival of World War II because that cemented their legacy. And they were able to latch upon that as clearing their tarnished image. But it wasn't until the end of World War II and the rise of Joseph McCarthy and his sting against American communists and un-American activities, that the left said, crap, if we are faced with this second Red Scare, which it was, we already know what the outcome will be for us if we don't attempt to pull the wool over the eyes of the American people, because they will kick us out of the offices of power again with the next election, because they will have seen us as empowering these organizations, peoples, and entities that are wedded to the ideology of red communism. And so they devised a new term. They started calling themselves the New Left. But the New Left had actually begun after World War I, when they had attempted to couch themselves in this idea of, we just want to regulate for the benefit of the people, and that may mean collectively. And now they assuredly meant that it was collectively, but they had to escape the specter of communism, which hung over their heads like a scythe that was threatening to decapitate their political movement. And so they doubled down on the language contained within it, and then they started this myth that FDR's New Deal program actually pulled the United States out of the Great Depression, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth, because the New Deal policies had actually placed the United States in a much weaker, more dangerous position. It was the Second World War that pulled us out of the Great Depression. But they had doubled down on this, and they obfuscated the truth by using yet another term, liberal. They discarded progressive because of its connections with the communist movements that existed in the early to late 20th centuries, and they started saying, no, we're liberals. And that was an intellectually disingenuous move as well, because what they were doing is trying to say, look, we're actually for liberty, we're liberals. But now they have so bastardized that term that it has such a strong and powerful negative connotation that that term is being forgotten and left by the wayside, as they are now coming out and calling themselves progressives, as Hillary has done in both instances of the nationally televised Democrat candidate debates. Or you even have now Bernie Sanders, Nerdface Sanders, out there claiming that he's a Democrat socialist, a democratic socialist. But that too is exactly what the progressive movement always has been. And so we haven't really seen a change. It's all the same, but we've just come full circle now. And that is why I thought this topic was so important to discuss, because it gives you a backdrop upon which you can actually discern what their characteristics are and what their agenda is, because their radical agenda has not changed, not once, in the entire history of the progressive movement, stretching all the way back to its inception with President Theodore Roosevelt. So we are now at a place 100 years after the fact of the first old left and this nefarious new left, to where we either embrace their policies and abandon our United States Constitution, which would ultimately lead to our death as a country, or we can embrace our Constitution and demand that our government strictly adhere to the principles that are contained within the four corners of that sacred document. And with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for choosing to fly with us, and to invite you to leave your comments or concerns on either our Facebook page, our YouTube page, or our Google Plus page. And I invite you to join Jeremy and I the next time that we go out on one of these excursions and fly you over the friendly airwaves in comfort and style while providing you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, because this is radio aviation excellence. Once again, folks, I am your Captain Randy Wright. Thank you for flying with us. I will see you next time.